Anyway, this is a project I've been working on for a number of years now. The field component of the project is largely wrapped up this year. We'll be continuing some of this work on a few of the streams. There'll be a lot more analyses and write-up coming over the next year or two. So this is kind of a update of where we are now as far as the project. The pictures I have here are both on the same stream. This is Otter Creek in the southern part of the driftless area in southwest Wisconsin, just to kind of illustrate the impact that the beaver dam can have on a driftless stream. The image on top is one of the rather long beaver dams we've seen in the driftless up in the headwaters of Otter Creek. The image on the bottom right is about a half mile downstream. So small streams in a driftless, beaver dam can get on them and make some pretty big impacts. So Wisconsin's long had a beaver control program in which, it's part of a core management strategy in the state, along with regulations and habitat management. Beaver control, resulting in involving the removal of beaver and beaver dams on a select number of trout streams with the intention of maintaining these free-flowing conditions, or no obstructions of beaver dams to the trout. Trout managers in the state and trout anglers alike have long considered beaver and trout to be incompatible with one another on streams, and that's kind of where this program has come from. Okay, there you go. Louder so we can hear you. Yep. Sure. So I'll start off by showing some pictures of the species of interest that I work on. Starting on the lower left, brook trout, obviously the Salmona native to our upper Midwest streams. The image on the top shows their native distribution in North America in the green. So here in the eastern part of Minnesota and throughout Wisconsin, kind of on the western and the southern edge of the native distribution of brook trout. The yellow areas show where they're introduced and naturalized, not native, including the lower peninsula of Michigan and then many of the streams in the Near Mountain West. Brown trout in the center, obviously not native to North America, but introduced into many of our streams, shown in yellow on that map above. A sport fish of great interest we manage for these species, or for the species in our streams. And then beaver on the lower right. And the image above that showing their distribution in North America, quite more broadly distributed compared to trout. Pretty much the only place you won't potentially find beaver in North America are in some of the Southwest deserts and up near the Arctic. So in Wisconsin, we have roughly, depending on the scale of the map you're using, 38,000 miles or so of streams in the state. About 13,000 miles of these are classified as coldwater trout streams. So those are the streams in which we manage for brook trout and brown trout. There are some rainbow trout and then some different salmons that run up in our Lake Superior tributaries and Lake Michigan tributaries. In the map in the center shows the distribution of our beaver control streams. So as part of trout management in the state, trout managers in the different counties have the option of having beaver control in their streams if they deem it necessary. This involves roughly 1,500 miles of streams, so a small percentage of what we have as far as trout streams in the state. Now, this control program has been reviewed over the years as part of our management plan. So I have pictures of on the right there, the beaver management plan, which is now, that plan ran through 2025. We're reviewing it right now, and the trout management plan as well. So beaver control is, to date, remained an important part of what we do for managing trout streams in the state. It's not without controversy, as you can imagine. There's a lot of differing opinions about beaver on trout streams, even among trout anglers. A lot of people love them there. A lot of people don't love them there. Other people don't even have an awareness of the program. So it's kind of all over the map. Excuse me, all over the map. The beaver control program itself is largely predicated on a few different studies that were done in the kind of mid to late 20th century, kind of mostly in northern streams in Wisconsin, and mostly on one stream in particular in northeast Wisconsin, North Branch Pembonbon River. But the work that came out of that limited amount of work has led to the statewide program, and that was kind of called out in their management plan, kind of identifying these are identifying that there are gaps in the science of what we understand about beaver and trout in streams across Wisconsin. So my work came out of the research recommendations that were in that management plan, and that led to the statewide work that I'm doing. So what I'm going to cover as far as observations that we've seen as part of the study are kind of classified into three different broad areas. The physical changes that we see to streams because beaver dams, due to beaver dams being built on them, the effects on trout population dynamics, and also the broader fish assemblages that you may see in streams. And then one I think is particularly important is evidence that beaver dams are in fact barriers to trout movement. And I'll spend a little time on that in detail. So I'll start off with a map just showing the scale of the work that I'm doing across the state. So again, this is a statewide project. We've selected study sites across the state where we have historically done beaver control work on streams. So we're collecting data on streams and regarding trout and beaver in all the areas that we do this type of management. The major approach that we've been using is taking streams that have historically had beaver control. So they've been maintained under free-flowing conditions for many years, taking that control off and letting beaver recolonize these streams, and then following the impacts that beaver have on those streams. Those are the symbols shown in red. The solid red symbols are, there's 23 of these streams. 18 of those 25 have had active beaver dams as part of the project. There is one stream where we went from the opposite direction. It had historically had beaver on that stream for a long time. We've taken dams off that stream. And then we also have over 250 control streams. I've shown some of these in black that I'm actively working on. A lot of these are streams that our fish managers survey on an annual basis. So we're making use of all the survey data that our fish managers around the state are collecting. Got a few images here just to give you a sense of the different types of streams that we've seen in the state and why it's so important that we're doing this study in all these different regions of the state. On the upper left is an image from a Lake Superior tributary up in Bayfield County, Wisconsin. These streams tend to be somewhat higher gradient for the state. They're among our coldest streams in the state. There's a lot of clay in this area. When you get precipitation events and high flows, these rivers tend to run red. And a lot of that clay, if there's beaver dams, it gets trapped in those dams and it really hardens them into place. And we find that they remain rather permanent. They're not easily dislodged by floodwaters. These streams do have stream resident populations of brook trout, but they're perhaps most important from a fisheries management perspective as being spawning in nursery areas for lake run submonids. So we have coho salmon, steelhead trout in particular, those two running up these streams in the fall or in the spring in the case of steelhead as well, and spawning, and then their offspring using these streams as nursery areas before running back to the lake. So very important for sustaining fisheries in Lake Superior. On the upper right is an image from north central Wisconsin in Lincoln County. This part of the state has a much lower relief kind of topography, very flat area. Small dams in this area can back up large amounts of water over large areas. And again, because you don't have that relief in the landscape, you don't get these heavy flood events that might dislodge these. So these dams tend to last a long time in that area and do tend to accumulate over time as well. In the lower right is a stream from the northeast part of the state in Marinette County. Streams in that area, a lot of them run through cedar swamp type habitat. Again, somewhat lower gradient. The picture there was taken at Bankful after a rain event. So as you can see, it's not a raging river, but when you do get these heavy rain events in the Northeast, a lot of those streams will rise slowly and then they'll fall very slowly as well. Those tend to be brook trout waters. And then the lower left is a driftless stream in Southwest Wisconsin, this one in Vernon County. And as you're probably more familiar with the driftless area, there's a lot more relief to the landscape there, particularly in the headwaters. These streams are prone to flash flooding. So you can get very destructive floods coming through here. And as such, it's always been thought that beaver dams are not as persistent in that part of the state, which I think is true to some extent. But again, it depends on how frequently you get big flash flooding events. I put this table up here just to give you a sense of the temporal aspect of the study. You don't need to be too concerned about the details on there, except that those red letter Bs show beaver dam activity in a given year. And I backdated this back to 2016. The project officially started in 2018. Took a couple of years of working with managers to get study sites set up. And then it's probably been, for the most part, about 3 to 4 to 5 years of beaver activity on study streams. But a few streams I've worked on for other purposes had beaver come on back in 2016, 2017. we're able to get those in the project without having any beaver control in those streams. So we do have some streams going back 7, 8, or 9 years of beaver activity at this point. And that's very important because one of the concerns about studies of beaver effects on trout is that the effects of beaver dams on streams initially may be one thing, and then over time, conditions change, and then it functions differently from the way it started. So that's why it's important that this is a study that goes over a number of years, exceeding 5 years. So jumping into some of our observations, I'll first show some images about the extent of the scale of impacts that beaver dams can have on some of our trout streams. This is LePage Creek up in Florence County, northeast Wisconsin. The image on the lower left is one of the major beaver dam on that stream. The red dot shows where the dam is on the other two aerial images. That dam has backed up water over 300 meters upstream, created a pool in this stream of about 2 hectares. Through that red horizontal line across showing the extent of that channel. So it's not all open water, but it's flooding a lot of vegetation and covering a very large area. The image on the right, looking top to bottom, shows the scale of that beaver impacted area compared to what the stream typically looks like without beaver activity further downstream. This is an image of Armstrong Creek in Lincoln County. This is a stream that's had beaver dams on it for many years. Again, this is a very flat area of the state, not a lot of relief. Small beaver dams on this stream just flood vast areas of water, as you see in this image. The image on the right is that same stream further downstream from the beaver activity, showing just how small that stream typically is. And that's one of the concerns about beaver dams on some of these smaller streams, in that you get that dam flooding these vast areas, it's significantly changing the amount of water that might be exposed to sunlight, for example, and leading to temperature effects on the stream, which I'll talk about in a bit. And then one last one, this is Benson Creek in Sawyer County, just south of Hayward. This is an image taken during the winter. The image on the right is, lower right is the beaver dam. That one beaver dam backed up a pool almost a kilometer, almost 1,000 meters upstream, covering about 7 hectares. And this image, again, taken during winter, shows that stream upstream of that beaver dam is largely frozen at this time of the year, except way up in the right where you can see the cold water, or in the case of in the winter, that warm spring water coming into that area. So as you can imagine, if you have a beaver dam on these lower gradient streams, creating these extremely long pools, stretching in some cases up to 1 kilometer upstream, you're greatly affecting what we would call the mesohabitat in the stream, or what an angler would refer to as that pool riffle run habitat. So again, pools being your deeper area of slower water, less surface turbulence. Riffles just the opposite, shallower, faster water, more surface turbulence. And then the runs, somewhat in between average depths. So that's the kind of habitat that gets lost when you have extensive pools being created. One of the ways that we've been measuring this and showing it visually is here. This is for Big Spring Branch in Iowa County, southern part of the Driftless area in Wisconsin. And these bar graphs are for 4 different sites on the stream. And what we'll do is just measuring across the survey site the length of pools, riffles, and runs. We color-coded these for the red showing pools, blue showing riffles, yellow showing runs. So typically in this stream, you see quite a variety of that pool riffle run type habitat, primarily riffles and runs interspersed with pools here and there. But when you do get beaver dams on streams like this, creates extensively long pools, just completely covering that habitat. What you lose also when that happens is the complexity of the substrate that you typically have in a stream. So we classify substrate based on the coarseness of the material in the stream bed. So you have your boulders, your bigger material, provides good fish habitat in many cases. Rubble cobble, somewhat in between, gravel, smaller, very important for trout spawning. We also have a lot of sand in our streams. Of note, in many of our northern streams that tend to be sandy, brook trout can spawn in those streams. Brown trout do not do as well spawning in those streams. And then silt, the one in the middle there. And I took that picture in a beaver impacted area after we had walked through it, just to kind of give a sense of what that silt looks like in these areas. And it's one of the things we find in many of our streams in Wisconsin. There's a lot of silt moving through them. You may not notice it typically when there's no reason for the silt to settle out, but when you have a dam come into these streams, that silt quickly starts settling and filling in these areas. And that's what you might see. This is a way we do measure that substrate composition in streams, and this is a way of visually representing that. So when we do a habitat survey, we'll go into a stream and do, according to our standard protocol, 12 transects equally spaced walking up the stream, and then at 4 equidistant points across that transect, measuring that composition of the substrate. What percentage of it is boulder versus rubble, cobble, gravel, sand, or silt? Color coded this to show that finer substrate in the warmer colors. So that orange and red, that's your silt and clay, the yellow sand, and then that green, blue, darker colors are the coarser substrates, the gravel, the rubble, cobble, boulder, which are important for trout. And here there's a beaver dam in the middle of that image. The bar graphs above that show all that silt being settling out and filling in the stream. And then below that shows what it typically is in that stream, where it's more dominated by coarser substrates. Again, this is a driftless area stream in southwest Wisconsin, higher gradient, typically a lot of gravel, rubble, cobble, boulder, but when you get a beaver dam put in there, that silt quickly settles in and fills everything, covering that stream bed. I want to throw in a few pictures of Rocky Branch. This is one of the streams I work on that's perhaps closest to where we are today. This is a tributary to the Kinnick River over in River Falls. And what's fascinating about this stream, it's a very sandy stream. And I don't know if that's perhaps the geology of the area, the urbanization of the watershed, or probably some combination of the two. But these are two aerial images taken on Rocky Branch, one in April 2024 and the other in July 2024. So in spring, there was a new beaver dam that was not there the previous fall. And you can kind of see that darker color of the pool that was created. In the lower image, by June into July, these pools were almost completely filled in with sand. It typically doesn't occur that fast, but in this stream it does. This is another image of that stream in April, again showing the beaver dam looking downstream. You can see the clear water and the depth of the pool that was created by that dam, and then the stream as it typically is downstream of that. And then just a couple months later, this almost completely filled in with sand to the point where that pool above the dam is about ankle deep. So my field crew out there standing in the pool above the beaver dam that was filled in with sand. And one other image, again, from the stream there. So there is typically enough gradient in the stream. So though sand is prevalent in the watershed, it does quickly move through, where you tend to see a lot of gravel and riffle areas. But with that beaver dam in there, initially creating a deep pool, good trout habitat, but within months, completely filling in with sand. So I'm going to change a bit to talk about temperature, and I'm going to show you one of my long-term data sets from Elk Creek. So this is a stream that's had beaver activity going back to 2016, 2017. And I've been working on this stream since I started in DNR back in 2003, 2004, in the case of this stream. And we've had multiple data loggers at two different locations since 2011. And one of the metrics that we use to kind of summarize the water temperature data as a kind of characteristic of the stream is July mean temperature. And if you look at the figure on the top, stream flows from the right side to the left. That red square is the upstream data logger. The blue square to the right or to the left is the downstream data logger. In between those, in the middle of that figure, you'll see those kind of yellow diamonds. That's a whole cluster of beaver dams that was built over a few-year period. So from 2011 up through about 2016, there were no beaver dams in that area. And it was remarkable that that July mean temperature was about 2 degrees Celsius cooler downstream year to year. So it varied from year to year just based on variation in air temperature, cool summers versus warmer summers. But it was always that 2 degrees Celsius cooler downstream. It's common in driftless streams. We have a lot of springs coming into these streams, and it tends to cool water as you go downstream. The beaver dams came in 2017, quickly started building up. And we started to see that those temperatures converging. By 2020, there was no difference between them. The blue is overlapping the red. And then after that, it started diverging, where now it's becoming warmer downstream than it was upstream. So data suggesting that beaver dams in this stream were warming the stream temperature. Still well within thermal tolerance limits for trout. It's still very much a trout stream and a very good one, but there is a temperature effect that's occurring. Those dams in that center area got taken out. That's an easement area. There's a landowner there that at one point decided it was time for them to go. We got them taken out. So in the last couple of years, you did not have those beaver dams obstructing flow anymore. And we started to see those temperatures diverting back to where they had been before. It's probably going to be a long process before the stream heals back to what it was prior to the beaver dams going in. So we're not seeing that 2 degrees Celsius difference, but it's one of the things we'll be monitoring as we go forward. Show one other example of temperature effects and then also tie it into what it does to trout and to other fish species in the stream. So this is Holmes Creek in Marinette County. The image you're looking at on the top there is looking up at a kind of a mixed meadow woodland area. There's a person walking in the stream there. You might see their head sticking up through the grasses. So it's a very narrow stream, rather deep. There are brook trout in there. There's a picture of brook trout that we caught. On the lower corner there, there's an image of my crew walking underneath a railroad underpass, and that's going to become important. So what happened was shortly after the study had started, Beaver moved into this area and started building dams, and they built one just on the downstream side of that railroad underpass. So that's the dam on the upper left there. You can kind of see the underpass now. It's just a few inches to maybe a foot. Nobody's walking under that anymore. On the lower left is looking at it from the upstream part. So the water's coming right in at the top of that underpass. And then on the image on the right, looking upstream. And what we saw from our aerial image was that one beaver dam combined with that raised railroad bed was created a kind of a unique situation where it flooded the stream upstream about 420 meters, and it created a pool of about, I guess, 3.5 hectares. Over time, well, rather quickly, that flooding killed all that vegetation. So you can see the dead vegetation in the flooded area itself. And then it sat there as still much of it shallow, but some of it deep water in the summertime, and really started heating up. Then what we saw in our temperature monitoring, this is about a couple hundred meters downstream from that beaver dam, was not particularly good for trout. So I've color-coded these on ways that we thermally classify streams. So on the left, it's June to August mean temperature. So we put a data logger out, measures water temperature every hour. And then we just average all those together for that 3-month period. On the right is for July. And temperatures underneath a certain level are what we classify as cold water streams. These are our best trout streams. You typically only find trout, maybe sculpin, but just cold water species there. The cold transition streams are also very good trout streams. Trout predominate in those streams, but you will occasionally see other fish species in addition to those cold water ones, maybe some white sucker, some creek chub, dace, but they tend to be incidental. They're not predominant. When it warms up to a warm transition stream, trout are now not quite as prevalent. They might still be there, but not in great numbers. But your fish species that are tolerant to those warmer conditions now are in greater abundance. And then warm water at the top there, the temperatures get hot enough, you will not find trout in those streams. And it's just fish that can tolerate warmer water. So over a few year period of that beaver dam going in, creating that flooded area combined with a railroad berm, warmed up that water temperature and flipped this from a cold water stream that supported brook trout to now a warm water stream that had no more brook trout in the upper portion of the stream. It did eventually cool down again as springs came in, but it took away a cold water stream. It did start to change a couple of years ago in 2023, I think it was in November. That dam had been affecting a landowner, and that at that point, the landowner finally said, I didn't want this dam in there, and took it out. And we didn't know that was happening, but that dam got taken out. So you no longer had that water backed up, keeping the temperatures warm, and we started to see the temperatures now dropping a little bit, but again, not healing back to where it was prior to the beaver dam. Again, the fish species, we refer to fish that are tolerant versus intolerant. Your trout species we consider intolerant to degraded conditions. So when you have trout in the stream, you have a pretty good indication that you have really good habitat in the stream, good thermal temperatures for this fish. Same with sculpin. When you do get degraded conditions for any reason, and those temperatures tend to warm, or maybe you lose or you get more silt in your substrate, you then start to see these other fish species like the western black-nosed dace, central mud minnow, stickleback, white suckers, creek chub, green sunfish, many other species as well. So I put this together just to kind of show what was changing in terms of fish assemblages. And you don't have to be too concerned about the writing on there, but again, these are kind of depictions of the stream, but color-coded. That's cold water, when the stream was cold water on the left, transitioning to the warm water on the right. And you have the railroad going to the top, then the beaver dams were formed, and then a couple road crossings downstream. The words that might be hard to read there are the different fish species that we saw. So when this was a cold water stream, we saw brook trout, we saw sculpin. I think we did see one mud minnow, but that was it. As that water started warming with the beaver dams there, we all of a sudden started seeing a lot of different fish species that you typically don't see in this portion of the stream. I highlighted the brook trout in yellow. And then as it continued to warm, we saw fewer brook trout. They eventually disappeared. And then by the time it became a warm water stream, we weren't even seeing sculpin. It was just this warm water fish. And I'll leave one final image of Holmes Creek. This is kind of before on the left, after on the right, when that beaver dam was removed in the fall of 2023. And then the image was taken in November of 2023. And you can kind of see to the left of that railroad berm how narrow that stream typically is in this in the absence of a beaver dam there. So I'll switch a bit to talking about trout in terms of trout numbers and trout population dynamics. I want to show this image. An angler I know in Wisconsin, Len Harris, likes to send me pictures that he takes when he goes fishing in the driftless area. And the thing I liked about this picture is looking at the size of the net that he's carrying on his back. And that is not a mistake. He purposely fishes for large trout in these driftless streams. And that's one of the unique things about our driftless streams, is that they can grow and support these very large fish. Typical large brown trout that you may see in many of our driftless streams in Wisconsin. So this is why we care so much about beaver control on these streams, because they're important trout fisheries. They're important for trophy trout fisheries essentially too. And this is a type of fish that we see. So I'm going to show you some data for Elk Creek. This here, I just want you to show the pattern. Those X's on there are beaver dams. So this is top to bottom, upstream to downstream. On the left, 2016, there were no beaver dams on Elk Creek. 2017, beaver dams started going in, and we let them go. And very quickly, they started proliferating up and down the stream, to the point where we're just seeing many, many dams up and down. Over time, a new dam might come in, flood an old dam, the other dam becomes submerged. Those are shown in those blue X's. Some of them get taken out by flooding. That happened on occasion in some of the dams on the public land. In the easement section in the middle, that was that section between my two data loggers. That's where one of the landowners came in at some point and decided to get the beaver dams out of there, and then you don't see them there anymore. So giving you a sense of the scale of how much beaver activity can happen on these streams. So it's not that one beaver built a dam on a trout stream, but it's that that beaver built a dam on a trout stream and met another beaver and had more beaver, and just up and down the stream, you can get a lot of dams. And even though this is in a higher gradient area, you do have some higher gradients in the headwaters. Over the course of the study, we just not have any big flash flooding type events that would take out all the dams on a stream like this. So these dams, many of them have persisted. Maybe I shouldn't have put this figure in here. It could be a little hard to explain, but I wanted to show just the sense of how trout numbers have changed in Elk Creek compared to other streams in the area. So the red symbols are surveys of trout in the beaver impacted area in Elk Creek. And then the gray bars are similar data taken on all the other trout streams that our fish managers survey in Richland and Vernon counties, the two surrounding counties of Elk Creek. And in the early part of this time series, those red dots tend to be higher on this graph. So they are higher densities of trout in Elk Creek compared to any of the other streams in the area. But over time, as beaver came in where that arrow is pointed, there's one oddball red point way up top. What happened there was that was a survey done just downstream of the first beaver dam that went in. So, and this was in October. So the spawning fish running upstream would have hit that dam and probably not get any further. So we were seeing a lot of fish that time. And then in subsequent years, there were more dams downstream, so you wouldn't have had that issue of trout running up to that point. And then as you get into more recent years, a lot of those red symbols are now showing very lower on the graph within what we see in other streams in the area. So what was an exceptionally good trout stream is now not quite as good of a trout stream. One other way of showing it is with these percentile curves. And all you need to know here is that if you sample a whole bunch of streams across the state and you get a density of trout, how many trout per mile, for example, your worst streams are going to be on the left, and then your best streams are going to be on the right in that figure. And these are different regions of the state. Elk Creek is in the west central region, so that's the line that shoots up the highest on there. And in the early part of the time series, that red line shows the density of trout in Elk Creek. It was essentially a top percentile stream in Wisconsin throughout the state. And over the course of the beaver activity in Elk Creek, the density dropped by about 45%. So what was a phenomenal trout stream in terms of trout numbers is now just a kind of an average good stream. So if you're an angler going to Elk Creek, you're still going to catch trout. There's probably a lot more in there than you think, given how difficult it can be to catch brown trout in some of these streams. But the numbers are quite a bit lower than what they had been. But the biggest change that happens in the stream happens to the bigger trout. So this is a roughly 20-inch brown trout, I think it is, that was caught in one of the recent springs or during spring, and it was downstream of that beaver dam. So that would be the first beaver dam now. It's in the lower portion of Elk Creek that these fish would come up to. We were only seeing big fish like that up to that point. Over the couple decades that I've been surveying Elk Creek, we would typically see in our spring and fall surveys at least 2 fish a year in the 18 to 22-inch range. And then quite a few fish in that 15, 16 to 18-inch range as well. After all the beaver activity in Elk Creek, we were no longer seeing those big fish up there. We were hard-pressed to find a fish over 15 inches. The only big ones we were seeing were downstream of the lowest beaver dam, where those fish maybe had bigger water down there. There's probably fish moving in Elk Creek from the Kickapoo River, but no longer making it in there. So that leads to fish movement and beaver dams. And I'll show you some data from the East Fork of Flag River. But I guess to preface that, one of the challenges of determining whether or not a trout can move past a beaver dam is the best way to do it is by tagging fish. You tag a fish in one place and see if that tagged fish shows up in another place. And was there an obstacle to it getting there? Now, we don't know when you do these studies, is it because the fish tried to get there and failed, or did it fail to try to get there? So one way around that is finding situations where fish are likely to try to move. And that's the case in the East Fork of the Flag River. So again, these are one of our Lake Superior tributaries where lake-run salmonids, in this case, coho salmon and steelhead, they'll run up the rivers in the fall to spawn. And in the case of steelhead, they'll also go up in the spring. This is a beaver dam on East Fork of Flag River. You can see by the people working with me in the stream above and below the beaver dam just how big that dam is. And if lake-run salmonids like coho and steelhead were able to get past that dam, that means they'd be able to spawn upstream of the dam. And then if we went back there the following year in late summer, early fall, and found young a year fish, that's your proof that those adults were there spawning. If you don't see those young year fish, that suggests those adults probably did not get up there. And that was the case on the East Fork of the Flag River. When those dams went in prior to the fall spawning period, came back the next year, we only saw young year coho salmon up to that first beaver dam. Anywhere upstream of that dam, we did not find any coho salmon. We did find some steelhead, and that was probably because these dams breached the following spring. There was a big snow melt runoff that year. I don't have the pictures here, but those dams were topped, and those steelhead were probably getting past those dams to spawn. This did repeat again the next year. The dams were rebuilt, and same thing happened. Spawners got up to that first dam, did not see any young year fish upstream of it. So evidence that lake run salmonids were not making it past beaver dams. And so those dams were likely precluding fish from accessing a lot of spawning habitat in these streams. I'll show two other examples very related concerning our inland trout, the brown trout and brook trout. So you don't have that same scenario where you can prove or show evidence of movement or non-movement just by presence of young year. Here you actually do have to tag the fish and see if a tagged fish got from one point to the other. And what we did here, this is Katy Creek over in Pierce and Dunn counties in Wisconsin. A stream with a very large population of brook trout and brown trout, mostly brook trout in the headwaters, brown trout downstream. But a series of beaver dams went in 2023, 3 dams close to each other. And what we did was we set up what we call these pit tag detection arrays. So we were tagging these fish, what we call a pit tag. It's a little kind of like small electronic tag about the size of a large grain of rice. You inject it into the fish. I'll show a picture of that in a minute. And then if you actively scan the water and that tag is within your scan range, it reads the tag and you know that fish is there. So we set up these pit tag antennas downstream and upstream of the beaver dams to see if these fish were passing through one and then the next one, showing that they had to have gotten through the beaver dams to get there. We tagged and released roughly just under 200 brook trout, over 600 brown trout, in a couple spots down the Ogali River up to where Katy Creek flows in, about a dozen different locations in Katy Creek up to the beaver dams, and then one location upstream of the beaver dams. Couple images. On the upper left is our scanning equipment. On the right are what the antennas look like. It's basically a loop of wire that crosses the top of the stream, loops down across the bottom of the stream bed and back. These are powered by batteries. They're continuously monitoring for tags. So they're scanning, I think it's roughly 10 times a second. So if a tagged fish swims upstream through that antenna loop, it'll ping the tag, record it on our equipment. And then these are paired antennas. So because you have them paired, you can tell directional movement. Is the fish moving upstream versus downstream? You have that pair downstream of the dams, pair upstream of the dams. I blew it. There's supposed to be data on that graph and it didn't show up. Oh. Okay, I'm going to have to tell you what it looked like. You're going to have to trust me on this. Basically, we released these fish in July and August. There were a few fish periodically being detected at our pit tag array downstream of the beaver dams. Come mid-October, that number spiked up and all these fish started running upstream. And so what was just a few fish here and there, all of a sudden we're seeing a lot of fish. This graph goes up. All these fish being detected by that pit array downstream of the beaver dam, none of them being detected by the pit array upstream of the beaver dam. So presumably they were going through, encountering the beaver dams, and that was as far as they can go. And what you can see on the bottom figure, that's water level in the stream. And so those spikes show flood events. So again, these are flashy systems. When you get a heavy rain, that water rises quickly and falls quickly. When that water spiked up during October, when these fish were running upstream to spawn, all of a sudden on that particular day, you would have seen a tall red bar showing all of a sudden these fish were getting by the beaver dam. So what's happening was that water level went up about just under 1 meter in height. And with that extra water, it was topping some of these dams or going around it and creating channels and avenues for these fish to get upstream. So you had the fish spawning, generally running upstream to spawn. You had the stimulus of these high flows, and now you didn't have the obstacle of the dams. So these fish were getting by the dams, and we were picking them up upstream, coinciding with that spike in flow there. I think this is going to show up on the next graph. I have another similar graph, so this will verify what I just said. We did similar work on Bohemian Valley Creek. This was the next year in 2024. We also did Katy Creek in 2024 again, with the beaver dams not there, and fish were just moving upstream with no obstacle to doing so. So in Bohemian Valley Creek, there was one dam. Here, in addition, we did another kind of stimulus for these fish to move. So in addition to it being fall, when brown trout are running upstream to spawn, it's just brown trout in Bohemian Valley. There were brook and brown in Katy Creek. We did this, what we call a mark displacement study. So we took these fish from the stream, half kilometer or so upstream, those two kind of bluish symbols, took those fish, tagged them, and then released them downstream of the beaver dam where the yellow symbol is. So when you take a fish out of the stream and you move it downstream, those trout are very good at getting back to where they came from. They're good at directional movement back upstream to where they came. If you were to displace them upstream, they tend to get a little bit confused and they're not as likely to go back to where they were. So these fish were wanting to go upstream to spawn and also wanting to go back upstream to get where they came from. Oh, that's not showing up either. Okay, well, what was different on this one, when we released those fish downstream, they didn't wait to go back up. They all of a sudden just started running up. So we released those fish downstream, and then the same day they all started going upstream. And you see this kind of big rise in number of fish going through our downstream pit array. And they were going up, encountering the dam. None of those fish were making it past the dam, but they were going up, turning around, going back downstream. And a lot of these fish are doing that over and over. So they run up, turn around, come back, go up and down, up and down. One fish did that 13 times within a week, just trying to get upstream and encountering that dam and not making it any further. We did have a rain event in, I don't know when it was, middle of October or something. And during that time, the water level rose not quite as high as what we saw in Katy Creek, but about 1/3 of a meter. And it probably did create side channels around the dam so that some of these fish were getting by. So we didn't see a big spike of fish getting upstream, but coincident with that rise in water level, you were starting to get some fish going past the dam. So to summarize all that from Katy Creek and Bohemian Valley Creek, it does appear that these dams are barriers to trout movement under normal low flow conditions, with the exception that if you do get high flows where water is either topping the dams or creating side channels around the dams, you can get some fish moving past them under those conditions. So I'll finish up with something positive about beaver dams and trout, and I'll show you perhaps the fattest trout that I've ever caught in any of our surveys. And this was taken in April, so it's probably not a spawner. And this is from Elk Creek, where I said we didn't see any big trout above the beaver dams. This is one exception. This was above that first beaver dam that a fish would encounter coming up Elk Creek. But what was unique about this was when we did a survey there in the fall, there was no dam there. When we came back in April, that was October, we came back in April, there was a dam there and another dam upstream of it. So these fish were bounded by two large beaver dams. And we were catching fat trout like this. The image on the upper right there is that pool. So on the right side of that image is the first beaver dam that fish would have encountered coming up. And then it comes up and around that bend, and there's another dam just past where you can see there. Created that very large, deep, wide pool. And we were just catching all these footballs in there. And when we were handling these fish, some of them were regurgitating food. And it was cranefly larvae. So these fish were gorging on cranefly larvae. And what we later figured out when we were poking around in some of these beaver dams here, these newer beaver dams appear to be really good habitat for cranefly larvae. I put those red dots on there. It's probably difficult to see the cranefly larvae, but each red dot is pointed to a cranefly larva in the beaver dam. So what we're seeing in these newer dams where the material is very loose, it just seems to be ideal habitat for that cranefly larva. And in the situations where you have that and these fish larvae are getting disrupted or falling in the stream, those fish are gorging on them and growing very quickly. So again, there were no beaver dams here in the fall. Roughly 6 months later, the dams were there and we were catching fish of this size. So there was a lot of growth going on in a very short period of time in terms of the condition of these fish. And then as these dams age and get older and the sediments tend to get packed in the dams get very dense and you do not see cranefly larvae like this. So it's, I think, very much a phenomenon of younger beaver dams. So I'll summarize with just some basic observations we've seen. Again, beaver dams and streams, I'm going to say there, can initially lead to some more and larger trout. You probably notice that more in brook trout streams, particularly in the smaller streams up north. You get a big pool in there, you can quickly get some bigger brook trout, as long as the pool habitat is there. As it fills in, you lose that habitat, you lose the big fish. There is evidence that beaver dams block spawning movements of trout, both brown trout and brook trout in our inland streams, coho and steelhead in our Lake Superior tributaries. There's been a disruption of trout population dynamics, including recruitment of trout, particularly in sections bounded by beaver dams. So when you, particularly when you have lots of beaver dams on a stream and it creates pool, it's just pool habitat and they all tend to silt in. You're not getting fish spawning in those pools. You're not getting a recruitment of fish from elsewhere coming in those pools. So trout numbers do tend to decline over time in that habitat. We've seen major changes in the physical stream habitat, including significant siltation in our streams. That's probably the biggest effect. We do have a lot of sediment moving through our streams in the Midwest, and you may not see it under typical conditions when there's no obstructions to flow, but as soon as you have that beaver dam put in there, they very quickly silt up. With the kind of oddball situation like on Rocky Branch, where it's very sandy, where these pools are actually filling in a matter of months. There is some evidence for warming water temperatures. This has been a very controversial thing. A lot of people will say beaver dams don't warm water, they cool it. Others will say they warm it, they don't cool it. The general consensus is, well, I don't know if it's a general consensus, but every stream is different. There's probably some warming effect anytime you get a beaver dam. Most of the times it's probably not measurable, particularly in a driftless stream where you have a lot of cold water springs coming in. That's going to obscure any warming from the dams. But when you get those situations up north where you don't have that cold spring input and where you get just these many hectare areas size pools on streams that you can normally step across, those areas can have a very significant effect on the temperature that you'll see in the downstream sections of those streams, like we saw in Holmes Creek, where it changed the section of the stream that was cold water supporting trout to warm water not supporting trout. So again, that disruption of the fish community dynamics. We do have a lot of fish species that could occur in our streams. And when these conditions change and you get a lot of siltation, you get temperature effects, that affects what fish species you see in the stream. So our ideal trout streams are not diverse. They tend to be just trout and maybe sculpin. And those are your best streams. When you do start seeing lots of other fish species in the streams, they tend to be, they're not going to be cold water fish species. They're, again, your suckers, your creek chubs, your minnows, various minnows. They tend to be a little more tolerant of warmer conditions. And that's kind of a signal that conditions have changed in the stream when you see those fish. And then I'll leave it at that. Beaver do appear to be very abundant in the driftless, but also throughout the state. Again, when we started this study, we had been controlling beaver on these streams for many years. Take that control off, beaver are showing up right away. And even many of the streams that we do control on, it's an annual process. It's not one and done. You never have to come back. And in the driftless area in particular, there's just a large abundance of beaver in our Wisconsin streams. So I'll leave it at that. Big thanks to my fish crew over the years who have been an immense help in a project that was very demanding in terms of travel time around the state. So Nick, Spencer, Kat, Ben, Mariana, and Emma, and also thanks to many other people in my agency that have helped out in this, and USDA Wildlife Services. If there's time for questions, I'm happy to stick around.
Yeah, but so thank you so much, Matt. First, we want to make sure we don't forget about the flies. So we need to announce the winner of the Paul Johnson flies, and the person needs to be here in person in the room. Craig, what's the last name? Craig Vandera.
so we're gonna Robert Richardson. All right.
Robert.
here we are.
Come on down. Okay, so we'll take some in the room question first. We're going to take a couple of questions. Then Mike do we have some online? Yep. So we'll start in the room first. Oh, you have a question? Is there any incentive for anybody to do beaver control? I need to repeat so the folks online can hear as well. You don't want to ship those back to Canada, do you?
If you want them,
Well, it's
Call me.
our national animal. I'll
Yeah.
take those.
I guess I'm not sure what you mean by incentive to move them. Incentive personally, or? Yeah.
So the beavers are everywhere in Canada, and what?
Say, well, the price of beaver pelts is low, so nobody is doing anything to go out and trap beavers.
Yep.
All right, when the price of pelts is high, people don't actually do things that benefit both the community. So.
Right.
In this situation, is there anybody that actually is doing any beaver control? It's all private property, it's state property, it's somebody else's property, but because of YouTubes and all that show beavers being cute, nobody does anything about beavers. So in these situations,
Yeah.
is there any go out and pay somebody or be rewarded to go out and get rid of these prisons?
I need
Well-
to repeat all this stuff. It's very long. So basically, is there an incentive to control the beaver population?
Well, first of all, I can't speak to rules and regulations in Minnesota. In Wisconsin, it's pretty liberal in the sense that if you're a landowner, you can control beaver if your land is adjacent to a stream. If you're a landowner affected by a beaver dam, you also can do that. So you don't need permission to do that in Wisconsin. Outside of that, you are not allowed as a private citizen to remove a beaver dam on public land. That's against the rules. The agency does have a beaver control program that our fish managers use. So we contract with USDA Wildlife Services to do that work for us. And again, that's on a small portion of our streams, kind of at the discretion of the fish managers based on their assessment of, is that important to protect the stream? I've given you some evidence of why that would be the case in many streams. It may not be in others. One of the other reasons why we do this also is to protect the investment we do in stream habitat development. So if you fish in Wisconsin, you buy a trout stamp, that trout stamp money goes to habitat work in streams. And when we spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on habitat work in the stream, the last thing a manager might want to see is a beaver come in, flood it, and bury it. So that's another incentive. I have heard of scenarios where there have been bounties paid to encourage people to trap. I know of someone who's a tribal member, their tribe has done that. I don't know if that's done outside of that typical scenario, but I'll leave it at that. Yep.
Matt, in Wisconsin, does the DNR have any jurisdiction to trap beavers or take dams out on private land if that's affecting trout fishing conditions up or downstream from that dam?
They do not. They can talk to a landowner and ask, but the landowner can refuse, and that's frequently the case. So the work that we do as far as control is typically on public land or on public easements.
We'll take the 3 questions in the room, then we'll go online.
What is the argument in favor of keeping these beaver dams?
There's a lot of arguments in favor of that. And again, I'll preface it that the work that's done on taking them out is on a very small percentage of coldwater streams, which is a very small percentage of streams overall. So the vast majority of streams in the state, there's no formal beaver control program. There's certainly a lot of wildlife benefits to having beaver dams on streams. I know a lot of duck hunters love beaver dams for that purpose. I've seen studies involving bats in beaver dams. There's so certainly many wildlife benefits. Just a kind of an anecdotal observation on the East Fork of the Flag River, where there was a beaver dam that we were studying as how it might affect the upstream movement of stream salmons. We had a wildlife camera on that. The intention was trying to see if we can capture any fish jumping over the dam. I don't think it was the right technology for that. From what I've seen about fish jumping, it happens so quickly, you need probably a specialized camera. That did not happen, but we just got phenomenal wildlife photos. Deer crossing, all kinds of fur bearers, bears. Beaver dams are very much a magnet for lots of wildlife.
So you mentioned the beaver management plan is ending in 2025. So based on the results of this study, do you anticipate any changes, like expansion of that control, the control programs, a reduction in that? What kind of changes?
I'm not sure I could answer that or should answer that just yet. I'll say that, so we're in the process now of working with an advisory committee. So it's a group of what you might call stakeholders or people representing trappers associations, retired wildlife and fish biologists, different conservation groups. Big diverse group of people with diverse interests about beaver dams. So that we're halfway through that process. We have a couple more meetings to go. That advisory group will then put together a document advising what the different people in this group think should or should not change from our current management plan. And then that plan will go to the agency and ultimately to our Natural Resources Board, where any changes would be finalized. That process, I'll just add, there will be public meetings in Wisconsin next year related to that. So if you're not on the advisory panel, doesn't mean you can't contribute your opinion about what should or should not be done with beaver management in general. So as far as commenting, I don't know. I don't think there's anything from stopping you from commenting. But I don't know the rules of that. Mhm.
Wisconsin doesn't allow, Wisconsin allows non-resident trapping from all states except Minnesota and Washington State.
I-
I would trap you.
I actually didn't know that. I'm not a trapper myself, but I would suggest you definitely should comment. Can't hurt.
My question is, as a beaver dam ages, usually what is developed is a wet meadow behind it. Do you have any data as to very, very long-term dams and the effect on water quality, trout habitat, and on dams that have been there for many years and those wet meadows have developed?
I don't have much information on that. That was one of the challenging aspects of the study. We wanted to find a number of dams that have been present for a long time on trout streams, where we could then take those dams out to see how those streams change in that scenario. And it was very difficult to find them for various reasons. Many of them would have been on private property and not available to us. Some of them were in, we found some in national forest land that the Forest Service is not willing to allow that type of experimental work to go on. Armstrong Creek, I showed you pictures of, was one of them that it was on county forest land where we were able to to do that, to take the dam out. And Armstrong Creek is technically what we call a Class 2 trout stream in Wisconsin, meaning that it should support year-to-year survival of trout. Reproduction may or may not take place. In all the surveys I did in that stream, we did not find a single trout. So that's a stream that has had beaver on it for a very long time and is no longer a trout stream. But as far as water quality data, that's other than temperature, that's something I haven't been collecting data on, so I can't say.
Okay, thank you. So we'll take some question online now.
All right, first question is we're going to go out west. TU National in their publications has talked about how beaver dams are beneficial out west and where there's predominantly snow melt as a source of the water versus springs. Are you familiar with any other reasons, or what are the reasons specifically that out west it's a different story for being beneficial for trout?
It is a lot different out west, and there's always been that historic difference between out west and here, or even here in the Northeast. Those streams tend to be much higher gradient. You have snowmelt coming off steep mountainsides. Beaver dams out there tend to be a lot more ephemeral, so they're not persisting as long over time, so they're coming and going very quickly. Whereas in many Wisconsin streams, you don't have that topographic relief in the landscape, and these dams tend to persist for very long periods of time. My predecessor in DNR had done a beaver study back in the 1980s on the north branch of the Pemmican River in northeast Wisconsin, and over the course of his study, they removed roughly over 600 beaver dams on a, I don't know, 10-kilometer or something long river. It was basically a beaver dam every 100 meters, 600 of those. So it's, again, showing how a lot of these streams allowing beaver to proliferate just created what used to be a free-flowing stream into a series of ponds. You don't see that out in the Intermountain West. It's just very different. It's very arid out there as well, so there's much more of a probably hydrologic benefit to many things to slow that water down out there. Here in the upper Midwest, we're not starved for water like they are out west, so we don't have that issue here. And then, of course, the spring issue as well. So there's just a lot of differences between the upper Midwest and the Intermountain West. So they're very different areas, and that's why we need to do research here to understand what beaver are doing to streams here, and can't just rely on what someone may have seen in another part of the state.
All right, we went out west. Now we're going to go back in time to pre-disturbance era.
Yep.
What were the beaver meadows and the beaver dam, kind of the density of it back then? And did that have any impact on the particular species that were thriving under those conditions? Do we know?
We don't know.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a common question I get, is that, you go back hundreds of years, beaver were here, trout were here. Why is it a problem now if it wasn't a problem then? But we don't know. We don't have data from back then. So we don't know if it was beaver came in a stream and trout were no longer there, and then the beaver were gone and trout came back, or if they were all there together. We just don't have that data. The other big issue is so much has changed on the landscape now compared to what it was hundreds of years ago. And, a good example is what that railroad did. If that railroad berm had not been there, that beaver dam might have been inconsequential to Holmes Creek. But with the railroad there, it just created this unique situation that you would not have seen hundreds of years ago. So it's some of the management issues we deal with today.
How about carnivores, otters, or other animals that might take advantage of beaver pond? Is that a second order effect that happens and that increases trout mortality?
Yeah, I've seen mink, for example, kind of hunting on a beaver dam and catching trout. So in many streams, you get these new beaver dams coming in, and you'll have all these sticks kind of lined up off the dam into the stream, and it creates a lot of good habitat for very small trout that'll come up and hide in there. And yeah, I've seen mink kind of hunting along there and catching trout. So there could be a mortality effect, but probably not to the extent that that would drive a loss of trout.
More than the other factors.
The other factors are far more.
All right,
important.
this was a quick question for our young, fresh beaver trapper. What is the going rate for a pelt? Okay. $15 to $20 is what. He's a amateur trapper. Okay, so you had the slides that showed the silt backing up, above the heads of the people below dam. And then, when there's a big rain or precipitation event, all that silt comes down. Someone is asking, are there proactive procedures that you do to try to, minimize the effect of that, or just let the storms do what they're going to do?
There's nothing you really can do with storms in these situations.
Either way, the silt is going to come down, right?
Right.
Okay, someone is just asking or is stating other things that are different. The higher elevations out west leads to much colder nighttime temperatures, which helps modulate the temperature difference. So that's a good point.
Yep.
All right, that's it for the online questions.
I will say in regards to those two images where the graphs didn't show up properly, I can send you a copy of that if you want.
Yeah,
But-
we do post it to a blog, and we'll wait for the corrected one.
Okay.
Okay, so we're about 5 minutes past 8:30. So I want to thank you, Matt, for coming tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was
Appreciate it.
very interesting.
Yeah.
And just want to remind everybody, so if you were at Oktoberfish and you want something, you didn't collect it yet, see Jonathan before you leave. And thank you so much, everybody, for coming. So our next meeting is in December at Fat Pens Brewery, not here, Fat Pens Brewery. Okay. Have a good night. Drive safe.